Hi, my name is Bill Tro, and I'm project manager with SRF Consulting Group, leading efforts on updating the transit development plan within the region. I wanted to start off the presentation for our final public meeting here, just taking a little bit of a review as to the steps that we follow in updating a transit development plan, or as we refer to it as the TDP. That there are essentially four phases or steps within the TDP process. The first one is to gather a lot of information about the current system, and then that is including both the fixed route services that are provided within Bismarck and Mandan and paratransit service. And here what we're looking at is how each of the systems perform, ridership, number of revenue miles, or the number of miles that it travels each year, how many hours of service are provided on an annual basis, and then also a little bit of information from a fixed route standpoint as to how each of the routes operate. And then our second step in it is also then looking at how well does the existing service really fit the needs that we have within the community. Are there areas of the community that could support transit service that don't have transit service? And essentially making sure that we understand where some of the gaps in service are. And then once we have an understanding of the existing system and to a certain extent where we anticipate growth within the region and growth within the region at a density that could support transit, our charge is to look at alternate service plans for providing transit service to those areas of the community that need it, and those areas of the community that can support it from a ridership standpoint. Because essentially we need to build a business model that says providing transit in these areas is economically viable for a public entity. It's not that we're out there, we're trying to turn a profit, but we do need to be providing cost-effective service within the region. And then the final step is where we're at today, is developing an overall plan of where we think we need to be going over the course of the next 6 years and how do we get there. One of the primary concerns that we have within Bismarck and Mandan is what I'm referring to here as a negative financial condition. And essentially what that means is that on an annual basis that the cost of providing service is outpacing the revenue that is available on each year to provide that service. And over on the right side of this slide, where I'm showing the transit reserves by year, that Bisman Transit has a reserve fund, which I think you can essentially equate to your personal savings account. That account is there for large purchases like replacing buses, and it's there for essentially as a rainy day fund. But you can see through the chart there that from 2016 through 2019 that reserve fund has been decreasing on an annual basis. And that's basically telling us that our costs of providing service are outpacing the revenue that is coming in. And currently, that on an annual basis, for the last 2 years anyway, that the cost of providing service has outpaced revenues by about $500,000, which represents about 11% of the annual operating costs. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is that, particularly even when we look at the graphic here, is that condition cannot continue to prevail, because if it does, that by 2020, that we would have exhausted the reserve fund that's out there. So one of the questions that is very critical to ask is, well, what really has changed since 2015, 2016, where there was growth that has led to the decline in the reserve funds that are out there? A couple of things have occurred is that the system has gone to full-time drivers, which then includes a little bit higher of a wage. That includes also the benefit package. And the positive out of that is that there's been fewer crashes, more on-time performance of the system, and better retention of the drivers that they have. So the training that drivers go through is that we're benefiting from that for a longer period of time. While the costs have also been going up a little bit based on those full-time drivers, is that we've also seen a declining amount of the state funding. It has been about $150,000 a year. We've seen declining federal funds over that same period of about $350,000 a year. And we've also seen some declines in the revenue that has been generated from some of the local partners. And each of these combined, you can see, gets us to about that $500,000, even though over the course of that time we have had more dollars available to spend on transit, that the declines that we see here have been influencing the need then to tap into those reserves to be able to maintain the level of service that's being provided. So, and I think one of the things that we want to emphasize is that we cannot continue down the path that we're at today. Is we either have to find additional resources, or we're going to have to reduce the level of service that we are providing. And that's what we're showing here, is that we see there are two alternate future directions that we can take transit within the region. That if we continue along the current path, is that we are likely looking at recommendations of reducing service. And that could be a reduction in service on fixed route alone. That could be reduction in service on paratransit alone, or that could be taking and sharing that responsibility for service reductions between fixed route and paratransit. But there is the opportunity, I think, within the region for the alternate of, if we can increase funds, there is the opportunity to be able to enhance service. Is that I think we can demonstrate that there is a need for and a demand for transit within the region, but we need to make sure that we're funding it to a level that it provides utility to those folks that need to or want to use the service. I think, and as we're looking at that investment in the region, I think what we've been doing is comparing the Bismarck-Mandan investment in transit relative to some of the peers in the upper Midwest. And that's what this table shows. And I want to focus on the column there that reads fixed route operating investment per capita and paratransit operating investment per capita. And this is essentially how many dollars are we allocating to operate either fixed route service or paratransit service in the region per person that lives here. And the key that I want to point out here is that when we're looking at fixed route service, that $19.66 per capita per year for fixed route service within the region, that is one of the lowest amounts of investment that we're making in fixed route service relative to the peers that are shown here, including Billings, Montana, Fargo-Moorhead, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, Rapid City, South Dakota, and Sioux Falls. Is that other than Rapid City, that the investment that we're making into fixed route service on a per person basis in town is considerably less than the peers. But if we also then look at paratransit, what you can see from the table is that we are spending more dollars per capita in the region on paratransit than any of the peers within the list that we're showing here. And that is, I think, that is just something critical to understand as to where are the investments in service going within the region. So I've already pointed out that if we want to maintain or expand the service that we have within the community, we're going to need to find additional funding, or the result is that we're going to have to find, that we would then have to make the hard choice of making cuts to service. And if we had to make those hard choices, what we're showing here is the potential choices that could be made, that each of these, if we were to essentially make a reduction or make service available to fewer people within the region, each of these then leads to the potential to reduce the overall cost of service. None of these are good choices, I think, relative to the need for transit service within the region, but these are the array, I'll say, of hard choices that we are going to have to evaluate if we cannot find additional funding within the region. Because I think another thing I do need to point out is that while the previous table showed how we compared to other communities within the region, I think one of the things we want to point out is that the cost of providing either paratransit or fixed route service within the region are both very cost effective relative to our peers. So the recommendations, or the preliminary recommendations that we've provided, focusing on the idea that if we need to reduce the overall operating budget, what are the kind of the line items that we would suggest or recommend that are made within the region to reduce the operating cost by about that $500,000 that we are short. That the first recommendation that we're making is that today that you would take the purple and brown, which are the routes that are serving, they're traveling back and forth between Bismarck and Mandan, that we convert that 1 hour route or 1 hour frequency on those routes to 2 hours. And that will essentially save us a bus and one operator. And then that is a annual cost savings of about $235,000. The next recommendation that we're making is to eliminate the senior qualification for using the paratransit service. Understanding that this is not an easy choice to make, but it is a choice that has the potential to save a considerable number of dollars on an annual basis in the overall cost to providing transit service. One of the things that we do want to point out here is that while folks within the region that are 70 years or older don't need to qualify to use paratransit, they're made available, the service is made available to them as they are over 70, so that there are folks that are over 70 that are using the senior qualification that are likely paratransit qualified based on a disability, but it's just less paperwork, less of a process if you're over 70 years old. So we do understand that there is probably a percentage of those folks that are over 70 that would qualify for paratransit. So this cost savings is probably a little bit overstating what that might be. And then the third recommendation that we're making is that we eliminate evening paratransit service. That right now, fixed route service runs until 7 o'clock p.m. Paratransit service runs until about midnight on weekdays and on Saturdays. What we're suggesting is that the paratransit service also stop at 7 o'clock, consistent with fixed route service. So those are our, I'll call them our hard choice recommendations, with the understanding that our goal out of these recommendations is to close that annual, operating funding gap. But if we're able to close the funding gap and increase the amount of revenue that's available, we would be able to then provide some new services that we see are valuable within the region. And along with looking at new service, we want to emphasize that would allow us to keep the current level of paratransit service. That would include the days of the week that it's provided, so you still have 7 days a week service, and the hours of the day. But we would need to find a considerable amount of additional funds within the region. And then we could also then provide some services that would add some frequency and or add service coverage within the metropolitan area. So what might those services be that if we can find additional funds within the region that we would do? And the first one is what we are calling as our Mandan Flex Route. And the area that we're showing in kind of the pinkish or the magenta there is what we would call is a flex zone. So that within that area, that if you're traveling within Mandan, that you would be able to the service would essentially be like paratransit, where you would call Bisman Transit and arrange for your curb to curb trip from your origin, say your home, to the grocery store, is that you would call transit, say, I need to go to the grocery store, I want to get picked up at about this time, and make my trip, and then arrange for a return trip. So it would be a curb to curb service within Mandan for everyone. And that with the flex service also is that we would have it set up so that there are some specific points in time where the bus would always be at Walmart or always be at Dan's. So you would establish that maybe at the top of the hour of each hour we're going to be at Walmart, and at the half hour we're going to be at Dan's supermarket, so that people would have a good understanding as to when they could be expected to be at those two primary destinations within Mandan. And then another key element of this is that you can see is that we're continuing to show the brown route, but what we're suggesting in order to fund the flex service within Mandan is that we would discontinue the purple route, so that if you were going to Bismarck State College from Mandan, is that you would use the flex route or the brown route to get to the transit center in Bismarck on Front Avenue, and then transfer to the blue route to get service up to Bismarck State College. One of the other critical things that we want to point out here is that with paratransit, is that the paratransit service that travels back and forth between Bismarck and Mandan would continue as it is today. And what we're suggesting within the Mandan flex zone is that if you're a paratransit user staying in Mandan or a general purpose user staying within Mandan, that those folks would be mixed into the same trips to try to make sure that we can keep a good level of ridership on each trip to keep that cost per trip down. And one of the benefits of this alternative is that there's more coverage within Mandan of some level of transit service. And it's also a curb-to-curb service. That the second recommendation that we're making, again, that if we can find additional funds, is that what we're titling this one is that we would strengthen the core in Bismarck. Is that what we're calling the core in Bismarck is the blue route that essentially goes from the Kirkwood Mall area up to Bismarck State College and serves kind of that central part of Bismarck and that near northwest part of Bismarck, and the black route, which goes from essentially downtown and serves up to the areas up to the north side in Bismarck. That these are the routes that serve the densest part of the community. And we're suggesting there is that if we can find additional funds, is that we convert those from a 60-minute frequency route to a 30-minute frequency route. And that at the same time, what we would recommend is that then also converting the red route, which operates on a 2-hour frequency, that we would operate that on a 1-hour frequency, keeping the same route that we have. And that the cost of each of these route changes is about the same. Each of them would cost about $220,000 a year. And I want to reiterate that this would be $220,000 in addition to closing the gap. Okay. And that then as a third alternative, that what we would suggest is the red route, particularly in the northwest part of Bismarck. And I think, if we all understand the type of development that we have in the northwest part of town, that there's a lot of single family residential, there's growing a number of apartments, there's a little bit of commercial, a little bit of office, but this is an area where fixed route is not as productive as it is in most areas of the community. So what we're suggesting is also looking at the flex route concept for the area north of I-94 and west of US 83 or State Street in Bismarck that would go all the way up north of the Walmart. And what we see as positives here is that more area would be covered, so that rather than having one route that would have, or the red route that goes essentially from the Walmart down to Bismarck State College, and having a relatively small portion of this area have access to some level of transit service, that a much broader area would have access to service. And like the Mandan alternative, we would have designated time points that at a specific time each hour, that service would be at Bismarck State College, service would be at Walmart, and we could even add another one in here, probably have service at Dan's Supermarket at a specific time. And again, this would be service that it would be a curb-to-curb service that you would call Bisman Transit and make arrangements for that trip. But also, though, if you were at, say, Bismarck State College and your desire was to go to Dan's, you would not have to call for that trip, because every hour the bus is going to be at Bismarck State College, and we would probably have Dan's as a time point. Or if you wanted to go to Bismarck College up to Walmart, you would not have to make arrangements for that trip. And as this would take about one bus, that it's going to cost about $200,000 a year. So those are the three expansions to service that if we could find additional dollars that we would recommend. So where are you going to find additional dollars? I think that the key that we want to point out here is that currently Bisman Transit Service is funded using some federal dollars, using some state dollars, using some local dollars, fares that are collected, and there are still a few local partners that are helping to provide some level of funding. Is that what we really see is that there's probably not going to be a tremendous opportunity for more federal funding for transit. There's probably not a good opportunity for more state funding for transit, so that if we want to close the gap, if we want to expand the amount of transit service that we're providing in the region, we're going to have to find additional funds locally. And what this graphic is showing is a combination of, well, what are some of those sources? What is the potential, as I'm calling it, the yield, or how many dollars could we generate on a relative basis from that particular idea? And the red dots are showing us probably how difficult it might be to implement that particular alternative for funding. I don't want to go through each and every one of these, but what I think I do want to point out is that from a yield standpoint, that generally sales tax provides an opportunity for the most dollars. But I think in that, depending on the particular location that we're in, that has been a source that we've found that people are willing to use that source. But when we look at, and another alternative might be property tax, that there seems to be across the country very, very little support for increasing property taxes. So that one you can see as a very large red circle, which means that we believe that it would be very difficult to implement that as a particular alternative. So that that here is the array of potential alternatives that we see, and that these Bisman Transit, the MPO, and local decision makers need to continue to evaluate as to what those opportunities might be. So I want to start wrapping up here, and that just to give everybody an understanding is that throughout this process, there's been some opportunities for various levels of engagement and input. This is our third round of public meetings. We completed a community survey early on in the process. We've had a steering committee that has been meeting throughout the process, made up of the city staff from both Bismarck and Mandan, and also with including the county. We also have a website where people can provide comments and people can obtain additional input. This presentation is, you picked it up off of or you can get access to the website and this presentation through the website. So what are our next steps? Is that we need to continue to refine the ideas based on the input that we're receiving at this meeting and the other public meetings that are ongoing this week. And that ultimately we need to put together the budgets over the course of the next 6 years. And if we are to expand service, what is the capital plan, or how many additional buses? Are there other facilities that we need to make sure that we're looking at the dollars for that? Our goal is to have a draft document in the next few weeks and have it done in February, and ultimately getting approval of the plan in April of this year. So if you want to provide comments, here is my information. You can either send me an email, you can give me a call, you can go to the website, and through the website, and the website is www.transitplanbizman.com. That through that you can also click on I want to leave a comment, or I want to send an email link, and we will be accepting comments on the concepts that we're talking about here through the 15th of February at the end of the day. And that you can also, that what we've got on the website, if you want to go out there, is that there will be a link on the website to the range of alternatives that we have been looking at for expanded service, and that you'll be able to then provide comments on each of those potential expansions. There'll be a series of them, and you can provide your comments on those. With that, this concludes the presentation for the public meeting. Again, if you have any comments, please send me an email, please give me a phone call, or you can go through the website and look for more information. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.